For most of human history, the Arctic was a place of myth and menace, a white wilderness at the top of the world that swallowed explorers and guarded its secrets beneath impenetrable sheets of ice. To the sailors of the 18th and 19th centuries, the polar north was not a prize, but a punishment, a region of crushing cold where wooden ships were splintered like matchsticks and entire expeditions vanished without a trace. The doomed voyage of Sir John Franklin in 1845, when two British vessels and 129 men disappeared while searching for the Northwest Passage, became a haunting symbol of the Arctic's indifference to human ambition. For centuries, this vast frozen ocean seemed to belong to no one, a forbidding buffer that separated the great powers rather than connecting them. Yet beneath the ice and silence, the Arctic was never truly empty. Indigenous peoples, the Inuit, the Sami, the Nenets, the Chukchi, and many others had lived across these lands for thousands of years, mastering an environment that destroyed the strongest of imperial navies. They built knowledge of the ice, the animals, and the seasons that no European chart could capture. When outsiders finally came in earnest, hunting whales, trading furs, and planting flags, they often survived only because of the skills and generosity of the people who had always called the North home. The early history of the Arctic is, in many ways, a story of arrogance meeting reality, of empires learning that their power ended where the permafrost began. The strategic awakening came slowly. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nations began racing not for resources, but for glory, sending men to plant flags at the North Pole itself. The bitter rivalry between explorers, the disputed claims of who reached the pole first, and the deaths of countless adventurers turned the Arctic into a stage for national pride. Norway's Roald Amundsen, America's Robert Peary, and others became household names, their triumphs and failures broadcast to a public hungry for tales of frozen heroism. The pole became a destination not because it held wealth, but because conquering it proved a nation's courage and capability before the watching world. Then came the 20th century's great transformation, the development of aviation, radio, and eventually nuclear power changed everything. Suddenly, the shortest distance between the industrial heartlands of North America and Eurasia ran directly over the top of the globe. The Arctic, once a dead end, became the center of the map. Military planners who had ignored the region for generations now stared at polar projections and realized that the frozen ocean was no longer a barrier, but a bridge and potentially a highway for bombers, missiles, and submarines. What had been the edge of the world was becoming, with terrifying speed, its strategic heart. This shift set the stage for everything that followed. The Arctic's value was no longer measured in whale oil or furs, but in geography itself, in the brutal logic of distance and trajectory that would soon define the nuclear age. As the world hardened into rival blocks, the empty North filled with hidden meaning. The ice that had killed Franklin's men and frustrated centuries of explorers was about to become the most closely watched and heavily contested frozen real estate on Earth, a silent frontier where the fate of civilizations might one day be decided. When the Cold War descended upon the world after 1945, the Arctic transformed almost overnight from a romantic frontier of explorers into the most dangerous strategic theater on the planet. The reason was brutally simple geography. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers locked in ideological and military confrontation, were closest to each other not across the Atlantic or Pacific, but across the frozen expanse of the polar north. A bomber or missile launch from one would travel over the Arctic to reach the other. The shortest path to annihilation ran directly over the ice, and so the ice became the front line of a war that, mercifully, never turned hot. The Americans and Canadians responded by building one of the most ambitious defensive systems ever conceived. Stretched across the Arctic territories of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland was the distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations designed to detect Soviet bombers crossing the pole. Constructing these installations in one of the harshest environments on Earth was a staggering feat of engineering and human endurance. Men labored in temperatures that froze flesh in minutes, hauling equipment across tundra and ice to build outposts whose only purpose was to watch the empty sky for the first signs of nuclear attack. The Arctic had become an enormous, frozen sensor, eternally listening for the sound of approaching doom. Beneath the ice, an even more secretive struggle unfolded. The development of nuclear-powered submarines gave both superpowers the ability to lurk for months beneath the polar ice cap, invisible and nearly undetectable. In 1958, the American submarine Nautilus made history by traveling beneath the North Pole itself, proving that the Arctic Ocean was now a hidden battlefield where submarines armed with nuclear missiles could hide, ready to strike. The Soviets, with their vast Arctic coastline, built enormous naval bases on the Kola Peninsula, home to a fleet that could threaten the entire Northern Hemisphere. The silent cat-and-mouse games played beneath the ice, where submarines stalked one another in total darkness, became one of the most tense and least understood aspects of the entire Cold War. Greenland, a vast frozen island governed by Denmark, became unexpectedly central to this confrontation. The Americans built Thule Air Base far above the Arctic Circle, a critical hub for early warning radar and a forward position for strategic bombers. The island's location made it indispensable, a frozen aircraft carrier permanently anchored between the superpowers. In 1968, disaster nearly struck when an American bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule, scattering radioactive material across the ice and triggering a frantic, secret cleanup. The incident revealed just how high the stakes had become, and how the Arctic's pristine wilderness now carried the constant, invisible threat of nuclear catastrophe. For decades, this frozen standoff defined the top of the world. The Arctic was militarized, monitored, and mapped as never before, its silence concealing radar arrays, submarine patrols, and weapons capable of ending civilization. Yet because deterrence held and neither side dared to strike, the region's strategic importance remained largely hidden from public view, a secret war fought in the cold and dark. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, many assumed the Arctic would return to its frozen slumber, its strategic significance melting away with the end of superpower rivalry. They could not have been more wrong, for a new and entirely different force was about to reshape the region forever. The end of the Cold War brought a brief illusion of peace to the Arctic, but a far more profound transformation was already underway, one driven not by politics, but by the planet itself. As global temperatures climbed through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Arctic began to warm at a rate nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the world. The ancient ice that had defined the region for millennia, that had crushed Franklin's ships and hidden Cold War submarines, was melting with frightening speed. Satellite images revealed a shrinking white cap at the top of the world, and scientists watched in alarm as summer sea ice retreated to record lows year after year. What had been a frozen fortress was becoming an open ocean. This melting unleashed something unexpected, a scramble for riches that had been locked beneath the ice for ages. Geologists estimated that the Arctic might hold a staggering portion of the world's undiscovered oil and natural gas, perhaps 13% of undiscovered oil and 30% of undiscovered gas, along with vast deposits of minerals and rare earth elements vital to modern technology. As the ice retreated, these resources became accessible for the first time in human history. Suddenly, the empty North was not a barrier or a battlefield, but a treasure chest, and the nations bordering the Arctic Ocean began eyeing the seabed with intense and growing interest. The frozen wilderness had become an economic frontier worth trillions. Even more dramatic was the opening of new sea routes. For centuries, sailors had died searching for a northwest passage through the Canadian Arctic and a northern sea route along the Russian coast, paths that could dramatically shorten the journey between Europe, Asia, and North America. As the ice melted, these legendary routes finally became navigable for part of the year. A ship traveling from Asia to Europe over the top of Russia could save thousands of miles and many days compared to the traditional route through the Suez Canal. The implications were enormous, promising to reshape global trade and grant immense strategic advantage to whoever controlled these emerging maritime highways. The Arctic was becoming a crossroads of the world economy. In 2007, the new scramble announced itself dramatically when a Russian expedition descended to the seabed beneath the North Pole and planted a titanium flag on the ocean floor. The gesture, both symbolic and provocative, signaled Russia's determination to claim a vast portion of the Arctic as its own. Under international law, nations could claim territory beyond their coasts if they could prove the seabed was a natural extension of their continental shelf. And so a quiet but intense scientific and legal battle erupted as countries mapped the ocean floor to support overlapping claims. Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States all advanced arguments over who owned the riches beneath the melting ice, transforming geology into geopolitics. The Arctic Council, formed in 1996, had hoped to manage the region through cooperation, environmental protection, and the inclusion of indigenous voices. For a time, it seemed the North might become a model of peaceful collaboration, a place where rivals worked together to safeguard a fragile environment. But as the resources became more accessible and the stakes grew higher, the spirit of cooperation began to fray. The melting that had opened the Arctic to opportunity was also opening it to competition, and the old strategic rivalries that had defined the Cold War were beginning to stir once again beneath the warming waters. The prize was too great, and the temptation too strong for the great powers to resist. By the third decade of the 21st century, the Arctic had become the stage for a new and dangerous competition, a contest for resources, routes, and military advantage that observers increasingly called the new Great Game. Russia, possessing by far the longest Arctic coastline, moved aggressively to reassert dominance over its northern frontier. It reopened and modernized Soviet-era military bases, deployed advanced missile systems, and built a fleet of powerful icebreakers unmatched by any other nation. Russian leaders spoke openly of the Arctic as central to their national destiny, a region holding both immense wealth and the key to projecting power across the Northern Hemisphere. The bear had returned to the ice, and it came armed. The other Arctic nations watched with growing concern and began to respond. The United States, which had long neglected its polar interests, awakened to the realization that it was falling behind, possessing only a handful of aging icebreakers compared to Russia's formidable fleet. American leaders began speaking of the Arctic in strategic terms once more, conducting military exercises, strengthening alliances, and even controversially expressing interest in acquiring Greenland for its strategic location and mineral wealth. The members of the NATO alliance, including Norway, Canada, and Denmark, increased their military presence and coordination, recognizing that the frozen North was once again a potential theater of confrontation between great powers. Into this rivalry stepped an unexpected player, China, a nation with no Arctic coastline whatsoever. Declaring itself a near-Arctic state, China announced ambitions to build a polar Silk Road, investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, scientific research, and resource extraction. Chinese icebreakers ventured into polar waters, and Chinese companies sought stakes in mining and energy projects across the region. This entry of a rising global superpower into the Arctic equation added a new layer of complexity and competition, alarming the traditional Arctic nations and signaling that the contest for the North was now truly global in scope. The ice at the top of the world had become a focus of the world's most powerful states. The tensions deepened further when Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shattered what remained of Arctic cooperation. The Arctic Council, once a symbol of peaceful collaboration, effectively froze its work with Russia, severing the diplomatic ties that had helped manage the region for decades. The accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO meant that nearly the entire Arctic was now ringed by the alliance, with Russia standing alone on the other side. The careful balance that had kept the North relatively peaceful since the Cold War's end was collapsing, replaced by suspicion, militarization, and the constant risk of miscalculation in one of the world's most fragile and contested environments. Today, the Arctic stands at a crossroads that will shape the future of the entire planet. It is a place where the climate crisis and great power rivalry collide with terrifying force, where melting ice reveals both unimaginable riches and unprecedented dangers. The decisions made in the coming years, whether the great powers choose cooperation or confrontation, will determine not only who controls the Arctic's wealth and waterways, but also whether this fragile region can be protected from exploitation and conflict. The frozen frontier that once killed explorers and hid nuclear submarines has become the next global battlefield, a silent expanse where the fate of nations, and perhaps the planet itself, may ultimately be decided.